Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we explore heartfelt tales of resilience, forgiveness, and the profound strength of human connection. Today's story is a journey through despair and redemption, as a young girl finds hope and love in the darkest of times. Stay with us for a story that will move your heart. The Miller family home in Atlanta, Georgia, was no stranger to heated arguments. But that night, it felt like the walls themselves were trembling. Emily, just 13 years old, stood trembling before her parents, George and Linda. Their voices rose like thunder, shaking her to her core. She had confessed something that shattered the illusion of control they held over their pristine family image. Emily was pregnant. Her father, George, was livid. "Do you know what you've done? You disgraced this family." "Emily," he bellowed, slamming his hand on the kitchen table, causing the fragile teacups on the counter to rattle. Emily's heart raced as tears welled up in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean." "Don't speak," Linda interrupted coldly, her arms crossed as she glared at Emily with a mixture of disappointment and fury. "Sorry doesn't change what you've done. You've ruined us. What will the neighbors say?" Emily tried to hold back her sobs. "Please, Mom, I didn't mean for this to happen." Linda sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Meaning doesn't matter now, does it? You've embarrassed us beyond repair." The argument reached its peak when George, consumed by rage, pointed toward the door. "Get out. You're not staying under this roof. You brought this on yourself. You can figure out how to deal with it." Emily froze, her young mind unable to process the weight of his words. Her own parents, the people who were supposed to protect her, were turning their backs on her. She stumbled out of the house into the cold night, clutching the few belongings she could grab in her haste. The streets of Atlanta were dark and unkind as rain began to fall. Emily's thin coat offered little protection against the downpour. Shivering, she wandered aimlessly, her tears mixing with the rain. She tried seeking shelter in an abandoned building, but the door slammed shut as the owner yelled, "No room for trouble here." Hours later, soaked to the bone and exhausted, Emily found herself in a small park. The cold metal bench she curled up on became her only refuge. Her hands instinctively cradled her stomach as fear and despair washed over her. In the distance, she heard the laughter of strangers and footsteps echoing menacingly in the night. Emily's heart pounded as she realized she wasn't alone. "Hey, girl," a coarse voice called out. Three figures emerged from the shadows, their faces twisted with malice. Emily backed away, her instincts screaming for her to run. "Where do you think you're going?" one of them sneered, stepping closer, summoning the last of her strength. Emily darted into the darkness, her feet splashed through puddles, her lungs burning as she pushed herself forward. She managed to escape, finding herself in a narrow alley. There, she collapsed against a wall, her sobs barely audible over the rain. "Why does everyone hate me?" she whispered to no one, clutching her stomach. The weight of her loneliness pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. Morning came with little relief. Emily's fevered body trembled as the relentless cold seeped into her bones. She closed her eyes, too weak to move, when a warm, gentle voice broke through the fog of her despair. "Child, what are you doing out here in the cold?" Emily opened her eyes to see an elderly woman leaning over her, holding a large umbrella. Her silver hair framed a face etched with concern. "Come now, let's get you out of this rain," the woman said, her voice soothing. Emily tried to respond, but exhaustion overtook her, and she fainted. When she awoke, she was inside a small, warm bakery in Savannah, Georgia. The air was filled with the comforting aroma of fresh pastries. The woman, Margaret Thompson, placed a steaming cup of tea in front of Emily. "Drink this. You'll feel better," Margaret said, her kind eyes never leaving Emily. Through choked sobs, Emily recounted her story, her parents' rejection, the cold streets, and her growing fear for her unborn child. Margaret listened intently, her hands resting on Emily's as she spoke. "You've been through so much," Margaret said softly, "but you're safe now. Stay here as long as you need." For the first time in days, Emily felt a flicker of hope. Margaret's bakery became a sanctuary. But the road ahead was far from easy. The neighbors began to whisper, their judgments loud and cutting. "Who is she?" they asked, eyeing Emily's growing belly. Margaret, however, refused to bow to the scrutiny. "This is my bakery, and I choose who stays here," she told them firmly, her voice unyielding. Despite the gossip and stares, Emily began to find solace in helping Margaret at the bakery. She learned to knead dough, bake bread, and serve customers. Slowly, she began to rebuild her strength, drawing inspiration from Margaret's unwavering kindness. But the world outside the bakery wasn't as forgiving. Emily's resilience would be tested time and again, as the whispers grew louder and the obstacles became more daunting. Yet, within the walls of Margaret's small bakery, she discovered a glimmer of strength she never knew she had, a strength that would carry her through the storms to come. Life at Margaret's bakery offered Emily a reprieve from the brutal rejection she had faced. But the world outside its warm walls remained harsh and unyielding. Though Margaret's kindness had given Emily a safe haven, the whispers and judgments of the Savannah neighborhood grew louder with each passing day. "Why is Margaret letting that girl stay with her?" a customer muttered under their breath one morning as Emily served them coffee. "She's trouble. That's why," another chimed in, their voice dripping with disdain. Emily pretended not to hear, but their words cut deep. She busied herself with tasks in the kitchen, hiding her tears as Margaret confronted the gossipers head-on. "She's done nothing to harm anyone," Margaret snapped, her firm tone silencing the chatter momentarily. "If you don't like it, you're welcome to take your business elsewhere." But the whispers didn't stop. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some customers stopped coming to the bakery altogether, claiming Margaret had tarnished her reputation by sheltering Emily. Even suppliers hesitated to work with her, fearing they'd lose their own clientele. The mounting pressure weighed heavily on Margaret, though she never let Emily see it. Late at night, when she thought Emily was asleep, Margaret would sit at the kitchen table, staring at piles of unpaid bills. Emily, however, began to notice the dark circles under Margaret's eyes and the way her movements grew slower each day. One afternoon, as Emily was wiping tables in the bakery, a man stormed in. Esteban, the owner of a nearby grocery store, was notorious for being nosy and unkind. His beady eyes narrowed as he pointed a finger at Emily. "Margaret, do you even know who she is?" he demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. "I've heard she was kicked out of her house for disgracing her family. You think keeping her here is a good idea? People are talking." Margaret, and not in a good way. Margaret didn't flinch, straightening her back. She stepped between Esteban and Emily. "What I do with my bakery is none of your concern. If you have nothing kind to say, I suggest you leave." Esteban glared at Emily one last time before storming out, muttering under his breath. Margaret turned to Emily, her expression softening. "Don't let him get to you, child. His words mean nothing." But Emily couldn't shake the fear that her presence was causing Margaret harm. That evening, she tried to voice her concerns. "Maybe I should leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm only making things harder for you." Margaret's response was immediate and resolute. "You are not going anywhere. Emily, this is your home now, and we'll face whatever comes together." Despite Margaret's assurance, the weight of the gossip and hostility began to take its toll on Emily. She noticed the bakery's business dwindling and resolved to help. She ventured out into the neighborhood to look for work, hoping to contribute financially. But rejection followed her at every turn. "We don't need help," one restaurant owner said curtly, his eyes darting to her pregnant belly. Another shopkeeper sneered. "You'd only bring trouble here. Move along." Emily returned to the bakery each evening with her shoulders slumped, her heart heavy with the world's cruelty. But the worst was yet to come. One evening, as Emily was closing up the bakery, the door swung open. Carlos, a neighborhood troublemaker, sauntered in with two of his friends. Their faces were filled with malice, their eyes scanning the room. "Where's the old lady?" Carlos asked, a smirk curling on his lips. She's not here, Emily replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Please leave. Carlos stepped closer, his smirk widening. Not so fast. We just wanted to have a little chat. You think you can live here peacefully after disgracing your family? You're ruining this neighborhood. Please, just go, Emily pleaded, her voice trembling. But Carlos ignored her, slamming his hand on the counter. Trouble follows you everywhere, doesn't it? Maybe it's time someone taught you a lesson. As his friends began to toss items off the shelves and onto the floor, Emily's fear turned to desperation. She tried to push past them to call for help, but they blocked her way, laughing as flour and freshly baked bread scattered across the room. Enough! Margaret's voice rang out as she appeared in the doorway, clutching a broom. Her frail figure seemed to grow taller as she glared at the men. Get out of here before I call the police. Carlos and his friends hesitated, then retreated with mocking laughs and threats about returning. Margaret rushed to Emily's side, her hands trembling. Are you all right, child? Emily nodded, but tears streamed down her face. I can't stay here. Margaret, I'm only making things worse for you. Margaret's gaze softened as she cupped Emily's face in her hands. You listen to me, Emily. This world may be cruel, but you are not alone. We'll get through this together. But even as Margaret spoke those words, Emily felt a deep sense of guilt. That night, as Margaret worked late into the evening, Emily watched her with a heavy heart. The lines of exhaustion on Margaret's face were undeniable. I can't let her suffer because of me, Emily thought to herself, her resolve hardening. She knew she couldn't keep dragging Margaret into her battles. As much as she loved her newfound family, Emily began to wonder if leaving was the only way to protect Margaret from further harm. The night Emily left Margaret's bakery was cold and still. Her handwritten notes sat on the kitchen table, a brief yet heartfelt goodbye that carried all her gratitude and sorrow. Emily believed she was sparing Margaret from further judgment and hardship, but the weight of leaving her only source of kindness pressed on her chest like a stone. She wandered the dark streets of Savannah, her small bag clutched tightly to her chest. Her steps were heavy, her destination uncertain. Eventually, she found a rundown boarding house on the outskirts of the city. The landlady, Dolores, barely looked at her as she tossed a key into Emily's trembling hands. Room 3. Don't bother me unless you're paying. Dolores snapped. The room was small, damp, and suffocatingly dark, but it was a roof over her head. Sitting on the creaky bed, Emily placed a protective hand on her growing belly and whispered, We'll make it, Anna, I promise. But life at the boarding house proved to be as cruel as the streets she had left behind. The other tenants whispered behind her back. Children mocked her openly, and even Dolores eyed her with suspicion. On her second day, Emily returned to find her belongings rifled through and her small stash of money stolen. When she tried to protest, Dolores accused her of theft instead. You're nothing but trouble, Dolores shouted, her sharp voice echoing through the halls. You've got 24 hours to pay up, or you're out. Emily felt the walls closing in around her. No matter where she turned, she was met with scorn and cruelty. That night, alone in the damp room, she wept quietly, holding her belly as though Anna's tiny presence could offer her comfort. The next morning, Emily left the boarding house, her heart shattered but her determination flickering faintly. She wandered aimlessly, searching for refuge in the unforgiving city. Her feet carried her back to the familiar streets near Margaret's bakery. She hadn't intended to return, but deep down, she yearned for the warmth she had left behind. Suddenly, a familiar voice broke through her haze of despair. Emily! It was Margaret, panting as she hurried toward her, clutching a worn umbrella against the drizzle. Her frail frame trembled as she reached out and pulled Emily into a tight embrace. You foolish child, Margaret scolded, her voice thick with emotion. Do you have any idea how worried I've been? Why did you leave? I didn't want to bring you any more trouble. Emily sobbed, clinging to Margaret as though she were her lifeline. Margaret cupped Emily's face in her hands, her warm eyes brimming with tears. Don't you see? You're not a burden to me. You're my family, Emily. And family doesn't abandon each other, no matter how hard life gets. Margaret's words melted the walls Emily had built around her heart. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe that she was worthy of love and kindness. The two returned to the bakery, where Margaret busied herself tidying up the mess left by the neighborhood troublemakers. Emily insisted on helping, determined to prove she could stand by Margaret's side and share the burden. Together, they baked bread and cleaned the counters, their shared efforts breathing life back into the small space. Days turned into weeks, and the bakery slowly regained its rhythm. Customers who once avoided the shop began to return, drawn in by the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread. Emily learned to ignore the judgmental stares and harsh whispers, focusing instead on her work and preparing for Anna's arrival. Margaret, ever the source of wisdom and strength, taught Emily more than just baking. She taught her resilience and forgiveness. The world will always have its harsh voices. "Child," Margaret said one evening as they prepared a fresh batch of dough, "but don't let them drown out the good. You have a future to build, and you're stronger than you think." As Emily grew more confident, she began to dream of a better life for her and Anna. With Margaret's encouragement, she saved small amounts of money, hoping to open a cafe one day, a place where everyone, no matter their story, could find warmth and acceptance. 13 years later, Emily's dream became a reality. Nestled on the outskirts of Savannah, the cafe, named after her daughter, Anna, had become a beloved community hub. The walls were adorned with cheerful photographs, and Margaret's cherished recipes were featured on the menu. Emily had built a life filled with love and purpose, all while raising her bright and compassionate daughter. One sunny morning, as Emily served customers at the counter, the cafe doorbell chimed. She turned and froze, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the doorway was Isabella, her mother, now an elderly woman with silver hair and eyes filled with regret. "Emily," Isabella said, her voice trembling, "I've come to ask for your forgiveness." The air grew heavy as customers fell silent. Emily's hands clenched at her sides as years of pain and anger rushed to the surface. "You abandoned me when I needed you most," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with hurt. "And now you think you could just walk back into my life?" Isabella lowered her gaze, tears streaming down her face. "I know I can never undo what I've done, but I can't live with this guilt any longer. Please, Emily, let me try to make things right." Margaret, now older but still sharp, approached and placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, my dear," Margaret said softly, "but it can free your heart from its pain." Emily turned to her daughter, who was watching the exchange with wide, curious eyes. Anna's voice broke the silence. "Mom, maybe she really wants to make things better. Shouldn't we give her a chance?" Emily looked at her daughter, then at Margaret, and finally at her mother. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. "It won't be easy," she said, her voice trembling, "but I'll try." Over time, Isabella became a part of their lives, working in the cafe and slowly rebuilding her relationship with Emily. Together, they created a new kind of family, imperfect but filled with love and the hope of healing. As Emily stood behind the counter one evening, watching Anna laugh with Margaret and Isabella, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. Her journey had been filled with pain, but it had also brought her strength, love, and the ability to forgive. In that moment, she knew she had built a life worth cherishing, a legacy of resilience and compassion that would endure for generations. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. Emily's story reminds us of the power of kindness and forgiveness, showing that even in the face of unimaginable hardship, love can light the way. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring tales of hope and humanity. We'll see you again soon on Empathy Stories.